Okay, well, we're going to get started. It is 12:03, 9:03 on the Pacific Coast in somewhat sunny, rainy, cloudy, cool San Francisco. And Mike, I'm going to turn over the screen for you to be able to use.
Okay.
Mike Kuczkowski makes a return appearance here on Tuesday Talks to give us an update on leader communications, how people are responding to the types of communications that organizations have been sending and are sending out over this period of time. As you will remember, Mike was in fact our first Tuesday Talk guest, where he showed and shared the information about how nearly 500 Americans were responding to the types of communications they were getting from their organizations during the early pandemic. And so this is phase 2 of his study. And we're excited to have you back, Mike, and happy that you can just lead us away.
Awesome. I think I just made all the orange bars disappear for some reason. Did that happen to you? Which one are you looking at, by the way? Are you looking at my
you're at the end. You're right at the very, very end of that. Yeah.
That's very odd. I'm using this, I almost always try to avoid using Microsoft's servers.
Yeah.
And I just clicked yes instead of no. And then maybe I'll try this on my desktop. It'll work, but sorry for the technical.
No worries, no worries.
All right, let's try this again. So.
There you go.
Okay, and are you looking at the version with 3 things or just the one?
The version that says May 19th.
Awesome.
COVID-19 changing trust in 1 month.
Right, which is your title. So thank you for that.
You're welcome.
So Terry, you were kind enough to kind of kick, give a little bit of a stamp of approval to this journey of figuring out what's happening when it comes to communications in the pandemic. I wanted to. We did a survey. We talked to you guys in, I think, early April about the survey we fielded at the end of March. I'll just kind of move past us. But this is a little bit of the journey that we've been on. So we're a communications firm. We do healthcare and corporate communications and have more of a consulting model, really. So we take pains to help our clients figure out, not just sort of what the communications campaign is or to craft the communications, but to build the systems that support it as well. And that's a more consultative effort. But when we saw this thing coming in March, we realized that the complexity was such, and it was in our sweet spot of healthcare communications, that we wanted to, play some role in it. So the first thing that we did was we put together this thing we called a briefing for leaders, and it had like a chart pack that explained what COVID-19 was, what the, dimensions of it were, what it meant to organizations potentially, so that people could be educated and make, in our view, make good decisions. Obviously, lots of organizations have tons of resources to attack something like this, but many don't. So we thought that would be a useful exercise. And in that, we embedded some leadership behaviors and practices that we thought were important, part of the model that we've been using for and kind of iterating on for several years. We're about 5 years old as a firm. And a lot of this stuff is rooted in the work that you guys are doing too on, what is excellent communications and things of that nature, I presume. So in April, we fielded a survey, actually end of March, and we presented it out to you guys. And that was our first effort to sort of get at what's happening, how are people communicating in this time, how are employees receiving that, and where does it appear to be strong, what are some of the issues, that sort of thing. What we did at the end of April was we fielded a new version of it. We added a few questions so that we'd have a little more robust data set around issues like trust, but also the types of communications that places were issuing, what seemed to be working, so that we could do a little more analysis on things. And so here's a little bit of what that leadership model looks like. So we kind of divide it into practices and behaviors. And some of these things have to do with, basic tactical communications executed well, utilizing the right channels, being consistent about things, sharing information early and often, the types of things that we have come to believe in as a firm, but also as things that aren't so easy just to put into practice in communications. Leaders really have to be present. They have to, show empathy. They have to be self-aware. And these are things that we try to work with our clients on, as well as the, mechanics and the systems around communications. So we wanted to test, is that framework working? And is it something we can discern in what's happening out there right now. So sort of to update what has happened since March, the basics are still pretty consistent across the board. I'll highlight some places where there were changes, but I'll move pretty quickly through the data set just as a baseline. So from March to April, slightly fewer people said that the public health response has had an impact on my organization. I wouldn't make much of the gap here. It's probably just evidence that it remains a very significant event in most people's experience. Slightly fewer people in April described this as a shift in activity, so you can see that number come down a little bit. I think that's just people settling into a new normal. We're not polling the same people. We're polling people, a broad sample of employed U.S. adults. So, again, I think people probably don't feel like it's a shift anymore because it's been in place for 6-7 weeks in many cases by the time we fielded the survey. We did ask a question about business office closure. I feel like if we were in Family Feud, I would say that's a winner because we got a lot of response around it. Not surprising, but lots of people have experienced that as well. And then when we asked them to describe the communications across a number of different dimensions, many of the answers you can see at the top of the chart, acknowledging the difficulty of the situation. Do the communications have a clear purpose? Are they using clear messages and consistent terminology? They're tracking about the same as they did in our first survey. Some improvement around what leaders know and don't know being evident in the communications, which is something that we feel very strongly about. If leaders don't know something, they should indicate that there's a reason why you're not hearing about something that's fairly obvious. And then slight, variance on people, suddenly feeling like the communications might be too infrequent. So an uptick in that, or in some cases too frequent. Getting it just right, kind of like Goldilocks's porridge, is part of the goal here. But definitely more of a settling down, and it's more frequent than usual, but slightly less than people were feeling in March. So I think people are just sort of settling into what we're describing as a new normal. And stop me along the way, by the way, if there are questions on a specific slide. I know there's a lot of data here. Happy to provide these later just so you can look through it. In terms of what's being discussed, so again, nothing here, overtook what was the response in March. We did ask about how the organization plans to resume operations after the pandemic, because we'd seen that was the subject of a lot of coverage. And so in April, you see, a fairly significant number of people saying that that's part of the discussion that's been shifting. But for the most part, communications hasn't started to discuss new things, maybe a little bit less on the recommendations for preventing the spread because we're not at that, kind of kickoff moment of the pandemic. But other than that, things are tracking pretty consistently across this. And then we asked people, and this is a critical question that you'll see come up again, and we've got 2 months of data on this, which is interesting, but how would they rate the communications? The only area that seemed like it was a significant difference from our standpoint was the messages about alleviating anxiety and concerns. We flagged this as the lowest area for communications in the first round of our survey, and you can see it coming up slightly, so about 7% increase in the rating on this. And these are all, when I talk about ratings, I'm focusing on the top 2 boxes. Extremely or very much in terms of how much these are effective in these ways. And then what do people want more of? You're seeing that appetite for more frequent communication popping when we ask that question. But again, across the board, we're seeing a reduction in the appetite for communications to do more heavy lifting. So, less of an urgency around more information about sick days, resources for emotional and mental health, less urgency around direct acknowledgement of misinformation. So all those gray bars represent March, and in April, you can see them coming down in their intensity a little bit. And then finally, this was kind of interesting, I thought, in terms of the commitment. So there was a not statistically significant increase from March to April in how interested people think their employers are in hearing feedback, which we do think is an important area. And frankly, those numbers to me are concerning. If I was a communications leader or CCO or something like that, I'd want to see those numbers up higher in the 60s if I could, just to convey the two-way relationship. But, you know, this is where they are nationally. But then, you know, in April, there's a bit of a decline in the emphasis that people are communicating about how much they think their organization is focused on satisfying their communications need right now. And, you know, I don't know that I would put this in a headline. We didn't actually, but it does seem like it's a little bit, you know, related to the settling in, less of a sense of urgency, but maybe also a little bit of a slackening to some degree of the communications primacy in this time. And we asked a new set of questions around when COVID-19 restrictions start to ease, so the public health interventions that we've seen across the country in the US, and I'm sure you guys have experienced it too. So when restrictions change, what issues do you expect your organization to address? Not surprisingly, top of the list is around resuming operations, but we thought this was interesting. Sort of the top set of these things are very much focused on personal safety. So there's the operational piece, how and when are people expected to appear, but then there's also, you know, how are we going to do this physical distancing thing? Particularly, I would imagine that's a big question for office workers or for workers in a place where customers are in the physical plant of their operations. Sanitation, personal protective equipment, how will employees be monitored? You know, all the issues are important, but I think the emphasis on personal safety is interesting here. So anyway, that's a quick look through some of the top line data. Any questions before I start to move into some of the associations and correlations that we found interesting in the data?
Yeah, Mike, did you distinguish whether these people actually work in those kind of settings? Because obviously there is significant differences between, you know, office, retail, and even manufacturing. There was a 60 Minutes segment last night on the Ford Motor Company coming back and what they're taking as well. So interesting to know whether or not, and you might think about this next time, is try to understand where these people operate and work.
Yeah, I think we looked at small, medium, and large businesses, which we divided in different areas, and we asked about the role that people play at the companies, but we didn't ask them about the kind of business that they were at. So that may well be something that we do want to ask in the next go around. We do have some metadata because we're using SurveyMonkey for this purpose that, you know, can help us. We can divide by region as well and income. But, you know, I think it's a good question for us to see if we can field. We want to, you know, keep the survey to some doable level, but in any event, you know, it does come up as an interesting question. And you see what this means to so many different types of contexts. Mm-hmm. So great point. Well, let's move into changing trust. So this was interesting to me. Now, I used to work at a company called Edelman that seems to own trust, and I was not eager to highlight trust necessarily as a big issue here. But, you know, nonetheless, it's a critical communications issue no matter what you do. And one of the factors here is we started out this pandemic with my former company declaring that, you know, this was the moment for business to lead because, you know, business had an opportunity with government and media in their January survey on trust having been shown to be, you know, less trusted institutions. And then in April, they released some data suggesting that hadn't happened. What was interesting about this is, you know, they look at things from which institution is leading in society. And this is really about what is happening within organizations from a more individual perspective. And when we added questions around what was your level of trust prior to the pandemic in your organization to do the right thing? And then how much do you trust your organization to do the right thing now? And at first glance, when we looked at it, I believe the levels of trust prior to the pandemic were 57%, and the levels of trust after, you know, now we're 59%. So that's not a particularly interesting piece. But when I dug into the data, I found this phenomenon, which was that, in fact, there had been a lot of movement underneath the surface. So while people were reporting trust had stayed relatively the same, the fact that we were asking the same individuals this question, how much did you trust prior and then how much do you trust now, allowed us to see that there was actually 17% of our survey respondents who said they had increased their trust, and you see them highlighted in green, and 17% had declined in trust. Now, in most cases, it's very rare that you can see someone who's gone from, not trusting their organization at all to now trusting them at an extreme level. That's an outlier. But for the most part, the movements are modest. But I don't think they're insignificant. So we wanted to take a look at what does this mean. We are basically asking people on a 5-point scale, just to walk you through the methodology, about prior trust and current trust. Whether they're accurately representing those questions is, open to interpretation, but they're not far apart from each other. It's like question 7, question 10. So I feel like they're, answering each one independently, and the movement is worth taking a closer look at. So again, this is what's happening. You can see that, a number of people who have moved up in the green, light green, and a number of folks who have moved down. Now, when I looked at the data across who had gained in trust, it was pretty unremarkable. There weren't really meaningful variations there. I could walk you through that data. It would be in an Excel spreadsheet because I didn't pull it into the slides. But it almost seemed as though if organizations were performing at a baseline to the mean, that those who, experienced that, maybe didn't trust their organizations as much, at high levels previously, they went up, just by experiencing what was sort of average communication. But when we looked at who had declined in trust, we saw some very interesting trends that I'll walk you through. In terms of, and this is, the gray bar represents the average. So all 469 people, not just the people who didn't move, but the whole package, what were their experiences on these measures versus the people who had declined in trust. And you can get a sense that the experience of people who have declined in trust is just a more frustrating experience overall. So the decliners were less likely to say that their leadership had acknowledged that these communications were acknowledging the difficulty of the situation. They were significantly less likely to say that the messages used were clear and used clear and consistent terminology, that they indicated leaders were available for discussions and questions, that they addressed misinformation, that they were showing people transparently what leaders know and don't know. They were also reporting significantly less that these communications had an appropriate tone. And frankly, along the frequency axis, you're more likely to say they were too infrequent, but sometimes likely to say they're too frequent. There was just a mixed bag here where it's pretty clear that people's needs are not being met by some of these baseline issues. In terms of what's been discussed, again, a number of areas where the people who are declining in trust are really saying, they're at a difference from the general population. So they're not getting as much information about, and this is sort of upside down, the general impact of COVID-19 on the organization. They're not getting as much information about, preventing the spread of COVID-19, about office cleanings. They're not getting as much information about how to triage priorities, about, sick days, emotional, mental health, things you can do to help your community, which I thought was interesting, and things your organization is helping to do to help the community. So across the board, I would almost look at this picture, and the aggregate seems like there's a deficit in terms of the issues that are being addressed in the communications. And finally, we asked them what do they want more of? And as you can see, on 11 of 15 measures, they said more of everything. Okay, so they're looking for more information about some of the things that we just talked about, the emotional, mental health, the sick days, what the organization is doing to help the community, but also significantly higher numbers are saying we want more transparency about what people know and don't know. We want to know more about how we're going to resume operations, information about testing, more frequent communication. This is on their list of, please, you can see it again, that appetite. The decliners are saying, I'd like more of this, which suggests it's not happening. Does this make a difference? In terms of the rating of communications, it makes a pretty significant difference. So we found that on these measures of trustworthiness, clarity, honesty, and openness, satisfaction, are these communications effective at telling us what we should do, what we should think? And are they effective at alleviating anxiety and concerns? You can see the average respondent is giving these companies reasonably high marks, but the folks who have declined in trust, it's translating into much lower levels of satisfaction across the board. So any questions about that?
Well, that's an amazing set of data that you have. And I think, organizations, every one of these communicators that are on the line right now are facing this same kind of issue, right? That you don't have a uniform response by all groups of people. And how do we then begin to isolate these decliners within a workplace, and to understand to what degree they have an impact on other people's perceptions of trustworthiness within the organization? Those that have that I've taught will remember my sort of continuum of groups of people, from supporters to skeptics, and or to even splenetics. And then these are the skeptics, right? It doesn't matter how much you show them, they're still not going to believe you, I don't think. So that this is a whole different study that you would want to sort of delve into these groups to really understand what could an organization do to increase your trust.
Yeah, it was really interesting. I mean, I looked at this, so I agree wholeheartedly that, when we looked at this, and this is an aspect of this whole study, is like, this is a study that can be replicated at an organizational level, and it can help. Yep. We're big believers in, high performing communications. And so I'm very frustrated, frankly, at the level of measurement that's being reported in communications at this moment. And this is sort of saying it's very much worth it, because if you can figure out not only how you're performing generally, but if you can look beneath the surface and identify those folks who may be, in a certain division, in a certain role, right, who are, in the sales group, or who are in the R&D department. Like these are things that you can do that relate directly to leadership and communications, and probably are things you can take actions around.
Absolutely. Interesting. Sarah raises a point about source of information. And I wonder if you also then did a correlation between political leanings, and to what degree people that are decliners have a different political leaning than those other that have an inclination in trust.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's been some work around trust factors. I'm curious about political leanings versus other attributes, socioeconomic, education-related attributes, as I said before, role-related attributes. But it would definitely be worth looking at. I mean, I think that these are people who, you can definitely see this bifurcation of society, like the polarization that we all talked about several months ago before we were briefly united under the threat of COVID-19 is starting to manifest largely in beaches in the United States, it would appear.
Right.
But I do think that there are kind of a cross-cutting section of sort of disenfranchised folks, or people who may feel like they don't have a voice in the organization, who are showing up strongly in the decliners category. Right. So I would look at political, but I would look at other dimensions of that to try to figure out, where they're coming from, and how do you reach them? Mm-hmm. It's probably, we did some analysis. I'm going to walk you through some other things that are more on the mechanics of communication, which obviously we all care about, that show there are these other things that matter to people that are related to, the satisfaction index, if you will, as well. And it'd be interesting to know, like, are these people the people who are, not getting things through the right channel, or who are just not feeling like we're addressing the right topics? I have a feeling that if you were to overlay right topics and, decliners, you would see a pretty high correlation, that they're just, for some reason or another, they're not getting the information that they feel they need.
Right.
Any other comments or inspired thoughts? Like, welcome that.
Nothing on the chat.
Let me roll on then. So one of the things that was striking to me about this, we asked a series of questions about, how accurate, how frequent, are you getting communications in the right channels? Are you addressing misinformation? Like, what are people experiencing from their communications? That also allowed us to kind of slice and dice the data. And when I was looking at those questions that were either yes, no binary questions, or on a scale that was pretty clear, I was struck by the difference between always getting things right from the receiver's end, right? The sense that that an organization is always accurate versus accurate most of the time. In part, this was a subject of some discussion and disagreement with me and my colleagues. I was like, well, if it's accurate most of the time, that seems good enough. But in fact, it would indicate, the data would indicate that it's not. So this is the data cut between people who viewed the communications as being accurate always versus most of the time. These were high numbers. So they were, out of our 469, about 135 said always, about 135 said most of the time, or something on that order. They could also have said sometimes, not very much, and not at all. And that represented about 20% of the overall population. But this was equal cuts, sort of 40% and 39. And the difference between the top two box scores for all of these effectiveness measures that I've walked you through before, satisfaction, trustworthiness, appropriateness of tone, clarity, these are big gaps, right? The difference between one, now we look at this two ways, and I'm very interested in your view on this. I view it as, well, if you take the time and you care enough to produce consistently accurate communication, look at the upside. My colleagues who balance me out very often in my optimism are like, look, you make one mistake and this is how much it falls off. Because again, it's most of the time accuracy. It's not, rarely accurate. So I just was struck by this though, because it's a very powerful force. If I were to take you through the subset of this and look at the difference between, extreme trust in always and most of the time, it's even more, accurate or even more expansive in terms of the gaps. So it would appear that focus on communications accuracy, again, that sort of tactical orientation, that expert orientation around communications of getting it right is really valuable. Having written a number of corrections in my earlier life as a journalist, I was a bit chagrined at this, but nonetheless.
I think, Mike, I think you can have both of what you just talked about. I think you can talk about the need to be as accurate as you can, right? So that people that believe that you are, always accurate, that the intent and purpose is there, you score higher. But if we get lazy or if we don't pay the same attention to the level of accuracy or transparency, that there is a cost. But the question is, what is that differential between always and most? Is that a one-timer, or is that, no, 7 out of 10 times that they're mostly accurate?
Yeah, I think it probably varies by audience too, knowing what we know, right? The scientific audience might be more critical and viewing things from a different kind of definition of accuracy than the lay audience might be. So I agree. We didn't know going in that we would see these fine distinctions leading to such outsized outcomes. Here's a little bit more on the outcomes front of like how.
Just wait a second before we go there. A question from Rob Esselman.
Sure.
Is this an issue of trust or a need to have a trusted source?
Well, we didn't delineate between sources, which were largely, talking about leadership within the organization, right? It's not political, scientific outside of the organization coming in. So I think, it's hard for us to discern between source and channel, if you will, although there's some data on channel that we'll get to. I have a feeling this is the way we're phrasing the questions here are about the overall aggregate accuracy of communications for the organization. So my sense is that, it's broadly leadership as a source, the CEO as a trusted spokesperson, but also the infrastructure of communications. My look at this data is that this suggests that having a well-resourced and well-supported communications function, to be accurate always is you got to be tied into leadership. You got to accurately know what they're, driving for, what the goals are. And so this is to me an argument for resourcing the function appropriately so that you can, get it right. I don't know if I'm answering your question.
Yep, that's good.
All right. And then here's a little bit more on sort of the outcome measures away from just the communication itself, but with the organization broadly. You can see that people who feel like communications is accurate always versus most of the time, rate the organization much more highly on their interest in hearing feedback, on their commitment to satisfying the communications needs of employees, on trust, on satisfaction. And it seems like there's, both prior to and during the pandemic, if you feel that the organizational communications hit that high bar of always accurate, you're more likely to rate these organizations highly across the board. So then we looked at a couple of other sort of tools in the toolkit of communications and see what their correlation is between outcomes and kind of ratings of communications. Now, I'd caution you, The accuracy piece, is on a sort of 5 different answers. So the difference between always and most of the time yields gaps that are not quite as meaningful as these next set of questions, because these next set of questions are really binary. So we ask people, is the frequency of communication that you're getting enough or not enough? Now, we did ask a separate question around how frequently are you getting communications? By and large, most of the people who said they're getting it frequently enough are getting it, somewhere between daily and once a week. And you can see a long tail of those who feel like they are not getting it frequently enough. And that is, from several times a month to, a monthly or less than that, which we were kind of shocked by. But this is the difference between respondents in again, their rating of communications based on whether they're getting it frequently enough or not frequently enough. So you can see, again, doing it, having a sense of how frequently you have to communicate to your audiences yields strong results. It's, again, this notion of a well-resourced and highly competent, high-performing communications function. We asked a similar question about, are you getting communications in the right channels? And we do have some data about what the right channels are and where they vary from small organizations to large, but none of them would particularly surprise you. Large organizations are more likely to have an intranet. Small organizations are more likely to use text messages. But by and large, if you feel like they're reaching you in the right channels, you're more likely to rate communications more highly across all of these measures. Are they addressing the right topics? Again, we see significant uptick for those who are saying yes, you're addressing the right topics versus those who feel like you're not. And again, this is an area where I would definitely look at the subset. We don't have a robust enough data set with 469 respondents to do this fine chopping. We get very small numbers, but I think this is where you would see a lot of correlation between distrust and people who feel like the communications is not addressing the right topics. And one of your favorite questions, Terry, is the organization effectively addressing misinformation and/or rumors? And I think this is a really interesting question, because you can see that those organizations that are seen as addressing misinformation and rumors well, the orange bars, are rated very highly on communications, and those who are seen as not doing that are rated lower. But then there's this pretty substantial group, and it's sort of a third, are saying not applicable. And I'd be very curious to know what that means. Do they honestly think there's no misinformation rumors to address? Or is they feeling like they're, in their particular case, everything's been so clear that it's just not an issue? But I don't know. You've spent a lot more time on the misinformation front, and analyzing these topics. I was sort of curious what your read might be, Terry. But
yeah, I think if they believe that there were a lot of rumors or disinformation or misinformation specifically about their company, they would have a point of view.
Right.
Right. So I think generally what you could conclude here is that most people don't believe that they have been subjected to misinformation or rumors from their company that way.
Right. But those that do feel that way,
Yeah.
they are rating the communications efforts much
Right.
lower. All right. So just gonna, I think I have like one more slide at the end here. But we did ask a question about, again, when restriction changed, what issues do you expect the organization to address? And I just wanted to spend a little bit of time on that. It seems to me, there's a lot of talk in the US, particularly around the wide variation of reopening communications and what that's going to look like. I wasn't able to pull a slide together, but we had a whole host of open-ended responses, and a lot of them were very much focused. Just like we asked people, what do you think the most important thing is, and what's the number one thing you want to hear more about going forward? Invariably, it is about personal safety again, and we saw a great sense of gratitude, frankly, from many open-ended respondents saying to the organization, we really want you to know you're doing a great job, which was gratifying. But we also saw a lot of interest in how are we going to get back to work? Let us work from home continuously. How are we going to address, COVID-19 infections, and who will know about what, and that sort of thing? And how are we going to handle the issues of personal protective equipment or better sanitation? So, it does feel like at the end of April, at least, people are continued to be, their sense of what they need to know is evolving a little bit. They're highly reliant on communications. Obviously, it's a big driver of trust. We can see some of the dimensions within that of what it looks like to get it right, and frankly, the cost of not getting it right. So, we're going to continue tracking this. We'll probably do the survey again early June, maybe end of May, depending on timing. But adding questions about trust and satisfaction to what we were doing, that, you know, in a way that allowed us to look at these subsets of data, was really interesting to us. And, you know, kind of welcome your thoughts and commentary on it if you've got any questions you might have. Happy to.
Well, Mike, this is really, really interesting data. And I think in this last one, you could almost begin to segment responses into at least 3 different categories. One, you know, how do people answer these questions that are wanting to get back to work, right? There's a subgroup of people that don't want to stay home anymore, right? They want to get back, and for different reasons. One, they don't think it's a concern, or, you know, that they just got to get out of the house. Those that on the other extreme that says, no, I don't want to leave the house. I don't want to ever go back to work. And then there's the middle ground is really uncertain, right? That they appreciate that you have to kind of get back there and are willing to go there, but what are the things that drive them to return, right? So really in those kind of 3 different chunks of people, you know, the never go backers, I'll go back to like, if you told me I have to be there in 5 minutes, I'll be there in 5 minutes.
Right.
And then those that are really uncertain. And to what degree, what are the different messages that would influence each of those?
Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, that's the shift that's happening, and we can kind of see it. And I think there's probably a really big economic driver for a lot of those folks who are eager to go back. But I don't know. I've been looking a lot. You know, all of a sudden we are overwhelmed with surveys. That wasn't the case when we did our first one about COVID-19 and what it means. And I'm generally a skeptic about things that say that, you know, the world has fundamentally changed in a short period of time on, you know, kind of behaviors and practices that are well established. But I have to admit, like, it's such a big issue. This seems to have broken through on, you know, a number of things, whether it's working from home, telehealth, you know, a number of factors that have had real barriers to adoption. Remote monitoring of health issues, things of that nature. You know, we're starting to see real change, and I think that people are, and my sense is that people are willing to continue in this way, particularly as it, you know, relates to their personal safety. And others are deeply frustrated and eager to move on. So,
you know, I think you could dive into this whole issue of, you know, behavioral change. Will people go back to how they behaved beforehand? And the inclination is most likely that yes, if they could, they would, because that was a comfort zone. This is uncomfortable. And the reason that the behavior has been changed is because it's been legislated, right? It's not that, you know, people have chosen to stay home because they want to, because we know as soon as you take those restrictions off, there's a group of people that are going to go back to normal behavior, go to the beaches, go to restaurants, you know, not worry about social distancing. So I think those are the kind of things that you also have to think about in terms of, you know, what will it be like with respect to the change, institutional or structural. What's the old phrase? Necessity is the mother of invention.
yeah,
right?
There's truth in that, you know. And I don't mean to interrupt, but I'm curious about, like, there has to be a way to probe people's values and their value orientation. Zeno did a very interesting study about, you know, how has there been a shift in values as a result of the pandemic? And, you know, it was a little bit more of a combination of self-reliance, but also of community-minded. So a sense that people are, you know, not optimistic perhaps about the economy, and they're going to rely on the skills and the things that they know they can do to get them through, which is sort of an old school, you know, Depression era value, if you will. But at the same time, you know, I was keenly interested in the notion that people are adopting these behaviors not necessarily singularly for their own benefit, but for the benefit of others. And does that, you know, create a little bit more of a willingness to sacrifice, or a willingness to do what might be right for the community? And that, I'm very curious where that plays out, because that leads to very interesting places, I think.
Right. Rob asked a question about why the last question about COVID in the past was asked. Is that good or bad to have had it?
Oh, I'm sorry. So yeah, It's a good question. I think we were at the time of the fielding this study, there is the whole question about herd immunity, which has been really distorted. We work in healthcare. So again, we have a point of view on some of those things. But the notion that if you have antibodies that would be protective from COVID-19, if you've had it before, that you wouldn't necessarily be a risk to reinfect, that would be a marker that you could almost have like a passport. I've had my antibody test, therefore I'm now immune for a period of time and I can go back to the workplace. So that's what that question was really trying to drive at.
Right.
There are some scientific questions about whether or not that, having those antibodies does in fact prevent reinfection. Some people are showing up that seem to continuously both test positive for the, infection and for the antibodies. And that's a mystery to scientists. Again, we have to remind ourselves we're dealing with something that we've known for not quite 5 months yet.
Right.
But yeah.
Colleen says, when you think about behavioral change, how honest are people going to be with the daily assessments some organizations are going to implement to gain access to the workplace?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I think you're going to see some, in the typical sense, you're going to see some highly compliant people and some people who are not compliant at all. I'm very interested in what this means for lots of different types of organizations. I've had a kind of a unique here in Marin County in California. I feel like I've watched this evolution of really, well into, we were among the first to close down. So that meant that it was among the first to start to cascade. What does it mean for a grocery store? What does it mean for a restaurant? What does it mean for, any number of different places? And so now we sort of stand outside of plastic shields where Pete's delivers our coffee onto a table with their, their gloves on, and, and people show up and they object to the fact that they can't be served if they don't have a mask on, and you have some of these little clashes going. And you also have like the physical distancing thing in grocery stores being a huge challenge. So I think that, if people can kind of move through a structured sense of like, where there's a temperature check or there's some other thing in order for you to be working there, if I'm getting at your question, and move into it, that becomes like a process that's pretty manageable. But if it comes down to self-reporting symptoms or other things like that, I agree with you. I think we're going to have a lot of, varying degrees. The symptoms here are so vague anyways for many people in their experience that, I'm not even sure what it's, it's so like the flu or like allergies in some respects, and it can be completely asymptomatic. So I'm not sure how much compliance we'll get. And I'm candidly kind of curious how organizations who really think about this what they'll ask of people.
Right. It'd be very interesting. Oni asked, with no school and summer camps, how are employers going to manage going back to work with limited childcare? How can you communicate to families?
Yeah, I think that, information about services or support that employees may be eligible for and some of these other aspects. I think people, frankly, leaders, the one thing about this is that this has been, kind of an indiscriminate set of changes. So leaders have experienced, even though they may have probably better structure and infrastructure around it, they've experienced their kids, working from home with them at school. I've got a house full of 3 kids now every day, and it's just full of joy, obviously. But, the changes here that are taking place, everybody's kind of exposed to them. And I hope that people in leadership positions are aware that, in many cases, the disparities in society have only been accentuated in all of this, right? So I would suspect that this question about schools, which frankly in my household, I have 3 kids. I've got 3 different approaches from different schools about what's going to happen in the summer and the fall. Public schools want to reopen in July. My son's community college experience will be online only in the fall, and we're still waiting to hear what my daughter's Catholic school experience will be like. So, I think that it's a great question, and it's one that communications are going to, I think, get more critical around once you get past these, critical, like, my health and safety and the health and safety of the people around me in the workplace. These things, they're not, you can see that they're actually still pretty important in people's minds about what we need to address.
Yeah, because the shift in empathy goes from personal health to personal economic well-being, right? Because at first we're saying we're doing this because we want to protect everybody, right? We empathize, but now with this pressure, the duality of the pressure by the person and even the organization to kind of sort of resume operations, there's a whole bunch of those other back behind the things that most organizations didn't ever have to worry about.
Well, absolutely. I mean, I think we've realized that we've constructed a system that, I mean, do we really have to do this? Do we have to spend, an hour and a half a day commuting to our offices in trains where we're, I mean, there are just these really basic questions that we took for granted that I think we now have to look at those assumptions. And, the school piece, I don't think people really did the math of saying, well, if my kid's school is closed on a more permanent basis, what do I do about childcare if I have to be in the office? Like, that was math we weren't even thinking about, right?
Yeah.
So I think, we're going to see some real, I think people are going to struggle with that, but I think there's going to be a real resistance to going back to the office if I don't actually have to be there. And, my experience with this, I don't know what you guys have been through, but 10 years ago or 15 years ago, we started talking workplace of the future. I used to manage Edelman's Pfizer business. So I'd be on site at Pfizer and I'd be back at Edelman, and I'd see, like, we were saying collaboration is the model. Let's eliminate the offices. Everybody's going to work across from each other. We're going to be like teams that, because we're so near to each other, we'll get better work done. And I'm not sure that actually was what was realized, but we certainly did eliminate cubicles and offices and the like. And, now we're being asked to do all that via technology. There will be a struggle.
Yeah. Any other questions from the group online? Mike, this is a fascinating piece, and the fact that you were in early, and if you continue to do it on a monthly basis, it's going to yield some very, very important learnings. First of all, it's going to capture a perspective that we tend to forget as we move on to these different phases. But I'm really happy and thankful that you've done this and that you've shared it with us as well. And I look forward for the opportunity of hearing more as you continue to go through this as well.
Well, thanks for your encouragement, Terry. I mean, I appreciate the general acknowledgement, but really, it was an early germ of an idea. Hey, we just put a piece together about this, should we test it? And, your encouragement, IPR's encouragement, the rest of it was really meaningful. And we're really happy with what we're learning through the process as well. So, after this, if you guys, I'm happy to share the presentation, but if you guys have other thoughts or questions you might ask, I've been taking notes on your suggestions, different data cuts that might be interesting, kind of welcome the feedback. Great.
All the best. Thank you very much, Mike. Have a great day. And thank you everybody for attending Tuesday Talks. All the best, everybody. Bye-bye.